I'm sure that most of you here have probably heard the story about the Thanksgiving ham. Do you know what I'm referring to when I say that? You heard the story about the Thanksgiving ham? How many of you know what I'm talking about? Well, I'm going to tell it anyway, and when I tell it, you'll say, yeah, I've heard that before. But it was Thanksgiving weekend, and the mother of the household was preparing Thanksgiving dinner. And she was in the kitchen working away, and she was just about ready to put the ham that they were going to have for Thanksgiving, just about ready to put it in the roast pan. And so, as she had done year after year, before putting it in the roast pan, she took a knife, and she cut a huge chunk off of the end of that ham, and then she proceeded to put both pieces in the roast pan. Her teenage daughter was there watching her do this, and it made her curious as to why she was doing that. And so she asked her mother, why do you do that? Why do you cut that chunk off and put it and put two of them in the pan? And her mother thought for a while and said, well, I really don't know why I do that. I guess I do it because my mother always did that. That's what, and so why don't you go ask her, go into the living room and ask your grandmother who was there for the Thanksgiving dinner. And so she did. And she went in and asked her grandmother why she did that and why her mother did that. And her grandmother said, well, I don't know why I did that. I do that because my mother did that. Well, why did your mother do that? She said, well, I guess it was because back then she didn't have a pan big enough for the whole thing, so she cut it in two and slipped it in kind of thing. And I guess I just got used to doing it that way, and we've continued to do it. You hear that story before? Yeah, some of you have, some of you haven't. Anyway, it's an amusing little story, but it's a story that illustrates, I think, this reality. That in families, and you know this as well as I do, in families, traditions and ways of doing things, they get passed down from generation to generation, and the farther down they get passed, and the harder it can be to answer that question, why do I do that? And why do we do that? Well, as we come to this third message in this series on becoming who God made me to be, I want to talk about forgetting what is behind. And I want to highlight the importance of us as disciples of Jesus asking that question, why do I do that? Why do I do this when it comes to certain behaviors that I have, or certain attitudes that I have in my mind, or certain values that I hold dear, or certain biases that I have? Why do I hold those? Why do I have those? Why do I do these things? Because here's the deal, friends, when it comes to the families that we were born into. We cannot separate who we are from our family of origin. We cannot separate who we are from our family of origin. Both the good things and the bad things about that family, the positive things and the negative things about that family, the blessings and the sins of that family, all of those things have shaped who we are today. They have shaped us and how we live in this world today. And friends, becoming who God made us to be will require something of us. It will require effort on our part, and the effort is to deal with any of the sinful patterns or any of the sinful attitudes or any of the sinful ways of thinking or any of the sinful ideas that we have inherited simply by being in the family that we were born into. Do you hear what I'm saying? And it will require us to intentionally ask that question of ourselves and ask that question of the Lord. Why do I react the way I do to those kinds of things? Why do I think the way I do? Why do I have this attitude toward this or that? Why do I have that approach to conflict? Why do I struggle with this? We'll need to ask that kind of question, those kinds of questions, if we're going to grow and we notice those things in our lives. So that's what I want to talk about this morning, and I'm going to pray as we do that. So, Father, this might not be an easy thing for us to talk about. We're really not going to get into it very deeply, but Lord, I pray, and we pray, that we might be open to the things you would say to us through this, and that we might be challenged, that we might be changed, that we might see things that we perhaps haven't seen before. And so, Lord, we give this time to you and ourselves to you. In Jesus' name, amen. You ever heard this saying that goes like this? You can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. You heard that, right? You can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. And it's true. There's none of us here I mean, if somebody's going to make that quote, then I've heard it different times, and normally it's been in the context of joking about some weird thing that happens in your family, and so it's, yeah, you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. And so or it might not be joking, and the person is really frustrated by some of the stuff that's going on in their family and the way their family works, and they're actually very serious about that. Yeah, you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. But it's true. It's true. You cannot choose your family. No one ever asked you which family you wanted to be born into, did they? You had no choice in that. You didn't get to pick that. But every one of us was born into a family of some sort or of some nature. And here's the thing about families. Every family has certain characteristics and certain traits. Just think of your own family. Certain characteristics and certain traits. By that I mean they have certain ways of thinking about the world. They have certain ways of relating to one another in the family. They have certain ways of living in the world. They have certain beliefs. They have certain values. They have certain biases. They have certain fears. They have certain dynamics. Every family has certain dynamics. It's called the family system. Every family has a system. Here's another thing about families. Every family has an atmosphere, or a flavor, if you will. And it can be a very positive atmosphere in that family where it's characterized by things like warmth and affection and affirmation and encouragement, lightness, and there's love there. It can be a positive atmosphere, or it can be a negative atmosphere that's characterized by things like coldness and criticism and judgment and anger and jealousy and hatred and those kinds of things. It's just dark and tense and hard, and it's an unloving kind of atmosphere that is there. It can be either one of those, or it can be anywhere on the continuum in between those two things. But every family has an atmosphere. Every family has a flavor. And no family, by the way, has a perfect atmosphere. You won't find one anywhere in this world. And here's another thing. When we are born into a particular family, you know what? We inherit those values. We inherit those behaviors, those characteristics. We inherit the environment, the atmosphere of that family. And that gets passed down from generation to generation. And how you and I live today, how we live today and think and relate is shaped by those things. Those aren't the only things that shape us. There's all kinds of things in the world that shape us. But I would say this, that most of our core values, most of our core behaviors, most of our core reactions, most of our core life ideas are rooted there in the family that we were brought up in. So this morning I want to look at this part of Joseph's story from the last chapter of the book of Genesis that Janet read for us. Because what we have here, friends, is an account of a man who has dealt with the negative story of his family. He didn't have it very easy, which we'll see in a moment. He dealt with the negative ways of his family that he was born into, and he experienced all those things, yet he opted to start a brand new, more positive narrative in his life rather than perpetuate the old one, which is what we can do with all of those negative things that we might have grown up with. He opted to do something different. And he did so, by the way, as we'll see in this passage, he did so when he had every reason not to. He had every reason to perpetuate the old ways of his family when his brothers came to him. Not only did he have all kinds of reason to do it, in his position in Egypt, he had the power to do it as well. You remember Joseph's story, right? You could tell it to me. Let's recount just a little bit of it. Joseph didn't have a very positive upbringing. He was only in his family for 17 years before he got sold into slavery, but he didn't have a very positive time. Even after he left, he didn't have a very positive time. And partly, it was of his own doing, but mostly it was because of the family he was born into. See, Joseph was born into a weird family. Actually, he was born into a dysfunctional family. Just think about it. Jacob, his father. Jacob, he had 2 wives, and he had 2 concubines, and he had children by all of them, and all 4 of his women, plus all of their children, lived under one roof. Okay, you talk about chaotic, you talk about conflict, you talk about, all kinds of stuff like that. And in this home, here's the weird thing, in this home, Jacob played favorites. He wasn't a very good father, I don't think. He played favorites, and Joseph was the favorite one for Jacob. Among all of his children, he favored Joseph. And Jacob let everybody know that. He wasn't shy about letting people know that that Joseph was his favorite, even to the point of providing that unique designer coat for him that he bought at Saks Fifth Avenue in New York when for all the rest of his kids he shopped at Frenchie's, or that kind of thing. He let them know. And consequently, we read in chapter 37 that Joseph's brothers hated him. It says there that they never spoke a kind word to him. Can you imagine that? 17 years of age, 17 years in that home, and all of these brothers there, and never did they speak a kind word to him. It was always a word that put him down, that insulted him, that said, you're nothing. Get out of here. We don't want you. They never, it says, spoke a kind word to him. He didn't have it easy. And of course, Joseph himself, in his immaturity, he didn't help the situation one little bit. Because being the favored one, and knowing that he was the favored one, he kind of camped on that a little bit. And he kind of rubbed it in. And he would snitch on his brothers. He would go to his father, knowing his father would listen to him and believe him. He would go to his father and he would say, they're not doing what they should do out there looking after the sheep. Read about it. He would snitch on them. And Joseph was proud and he was arrogant. He had these dreams, for example. One dream that he had was he and his brothers, they were out reaping the harvest, bringing the harvest in. And in that dream, the sheaves of wheat that his brothers gathered, they all bowed down to the one that Joseph had gathered. And then he had this dream about the moon and the sun and 11 stars bowing down to him, Joseph. And the worst thing was he went and told his brothers about that, went and told his father about that. And it says there that they hated him all the more because of that. And when he told his father was angry at him. His father rebuked him, it says, because Joseph was saying that the moon and the star, or the sun and the moon, by the way, were the father and the mother. And he was saying, they're going to bow down as well. And his father was angry, and he rebuked him and said, you mean you think we're going to bow down and worship you, or we're going to bow down to you? Joseph didn't help himself very much. He was arrogant, and he was proud. And of course, then the revenge came, the revenge incident, out in the wilderness near Dothan, when Joseph came to see his brothers and see how they were doing in terms of tending his father's sheep. They saw him coming, they saw the coat, and they seized him, they threw him in a pit, and eventually they sold him as a slave to this caravan that was passing by. They thought they were rid of him forever. And so true to the system in their family, what they did with that was they went home and they told Jacob, they lied to him. They went home and told Jacob that Joseph had been attacked by some ferocious animal and that he was dead. See, that was the atmosphere and the flavor of the family that Joseph was born into. It was an atmosphere of jealousy, an atmosphere of hatred, of anger, of deceitfulness, of revenge. It was a mess. And it didn't get much better when Joseph ended up in Egypt. Because for the first 10 to 12 to 15 years he was there, he was a slave. Then he was a prisoner in jail, falsely accused of raping Pharaoh's wife. That was his experience before things began to turn around for him, and he eventually became a governor in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. And so here we are now in chapter 50. Here we are now in the last chapter with a famine in full swing. And I'm going to skip a lot of the details here as to how this family got there. But the famine is in full swing. And Jacob, Joseph's father, and all of his brothers, and all of their families, and all of their sheep, and all of their cattle, by this time they had all moved to Egypt. And they were just settled into life there. Except on this day, Jacob had died. And the brothers were scared. They were scared. Because, friends, if there ever was an opportunity for Joseph to get his revenge, it was now. See, Jacob, for those 11 brothers, Jacob was their insurance policy. They essentially knew that as long as Jacob was alive, then Joseph wouldn't do anything to harm them out of respect for his father. But now Jacob was dead. And they became afraid that Joseph would now exact his revenge. Because in that culture, you know what? It was eye for eye and tooth for tooth. In that family, it was eye for eye and tooth for tooth. In their own hearts, it was eye for eye and tooth for tooth. And they were afraid that that's how Joseph was, and he would follow suit with the family system. It says in chapter 50 and verse 15 that when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs that we did to him? They were scared. And so what did they do? Well, true to their family system, true to the way they had always done things, they concocted a lie. And they lied to Joseph. They sent word to him saying this, that, before our father died, he gave us these instructions to give this message to you. And here was the message that was supposed to have come from Jacob. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Jacob was still their insurance policy, they thought. But I suspect that Joseph knew that they were lying. But here's Joseph. Here's Joseph. He could very easily have had his day in court that day and won. He very easily could have responded in a way that his family would have responded if they had been in his position. He could easily have responded in anger, with a spirit of vengeance, for all of these wrongs that had been done to him. But you know what? He didn't. He didn't. He didn't even come near to it. He didn't have a grudge against them, as they feared he did. And why was that? How was that for Joseph? Why did he not have that grudge? What had happened in Joseph's life that he didn't just put them in jail or sell them into slavery? I want to tell you what I think it is, and then I'll tell you why I think it's that. I think it's because he had already forgiven his brothers. He'd already forgiven them. At some point, I think, in the years since he had arrived in Egypt, Joseph had reflected back on his life. He had lots of time to do that, by the way. He was probably 10 years in jail, so you get lots of time to think when you're in jail. So I suspect he reflected on his life and what had happened to him. And he reflected back on all the abuse that he had received at the hands of his brothers and all that had happened to him through that family system. But rather than become bitter about all of it, he had, with God's help, and this wasn't Joseph alone. If you read through the account of Joseph in the book of Genesis, you'll find different times where it says that he tried to follow after God. He tried to remain faithful to God and obedient to God. And that was what his life. So it wasn't just Joseph. With God's help, somehow Joseph became reconciled within himself to the past. And he became reconciled within himself to it in such a way, or to such an extent, that he was able to forgive his brothers before they ever got there, before they ever came, before they ever even knew that Joseph still existed. He didn't have a grudge against them. He became able to forgive them. Now, why do I believe that that's what had happened? Well, I believe it because of what Joseph said to them when they came. After they sent the message, they then came and they fell, before him on their faces, and they said, have mercy, we're your slaves, kind of thing. And here's what he said. Listen to what he said. The first few words he said were these: don't be afraid. Verse 19, he said, don't be afraid. If you want to expand that, I think what he was saying was this: do not be afraid that I'm going to take revenge on you. And then he said this. This is a weird thing for him to say. Like, why did he say this? He said, am I in the place of God? Am I in, what's that mean? Why is he saying that? Am I in the place of God? I think what he was saying, friends, was this: I am not Yahweh. I am not the Yahweh who said, vengeance is mine. He realized that vengeance belonged to the Lord. And what he's saying here is that it's not my place to seek revenge. That's God's place. My place is to forgive. The Old Testament says that. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. It's repeated in the New Testament. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. So I believe he had already forgiven his brothers. But then he says this, a weird thing. He says this. He says, well, this isn't weird. He says, you intended to harm me. And what we learn from that, friends, and what that tells us, is that at some point in this process that Joseph was going through, he somehow embraced the hurt of the past. In other words, he faced the pain, he faced what had happened to him, all the wounds, and he embraced it in this sense that he didn't just gloss it over as though it didn't matter, that it didn't happen, and well, I'll just forget about that. He didn't deny the pain and the hurt that had happened to him. He didn't deny that. No, he said, you intended to harm me. He acknowledged the harm. It hurt. He didn't like it. And they did it. Because that's the other thing. Not only did he embrace the pain and the wounds and the hurt that they had caused him, but he said, you're the ones who did it. He said, you intended to harm me. You intended to harm me. This wasn't just kind of something that happened off the cuff. They intended to harm him. And they did it. He wasn't letting them off the hook with this forgiveness. And forgiveness doesn't let people off the hook. I think one of the things we learn about forgiveness here is this, that to forgive someone properly, someone who has hurt us, someone who has wounded us, someone who has done something against us, to forgive them properly, we have to first of all embrace the pain that is caused. We have to admit, yeah, that hurt. We don't have to say, I'm tough, that didn't hurt, but I'm going to get you. We have to say, yeah, that hurt. I didn't deserve that. That hurt. We have to be like Jesus in that sense. Our sins wounded the Lord, are offensive to the Lord. But when Jesus came, as we read in Isaiah 53, when Jesus came, he embraced all of that pain. He embraced all of that wounding that we had done. He took it all with him. All of that sin, he took it to the cross. He embraced it. He didn't say, oh no, it doesn't matter that you didn't do this. And he said, and you can't do anything about it, but I will embrace this. I'll take it. I'll take the pain. That's what you're doing when you're forgiving. You're saying, I will take the pain. I embrace it. I don't like it. It's not justified. But in order to forgive you, I will take it. And then we have to actually blame the perpetrator of that. We have to say, you're the one who caused it. And not say, oh, well, maybe it was something I did. Maybe it's something that I deserved. Or maybe I had part in it. Well, maybe you did. But the reality is, when that person hurt you, it was a choice that they made to do that. And they're accountable for that. They caused that. And I think we have to embrace the pain and blame the perpetrator, place the blame where it goes, and then we are ready to move on in the process of forgiveness. Anyway, I'm not going to follow that any further, because we could talk about then where you go from there. But I want to come back. Joseph then embraced the pain, and he called out the perpetrators of it. He says, you intended to harm me. But the other thing he did was this, and this is key. The other thing he did was this. He saw God's hand in it all. Because he said, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. And by the way, he isn't saying that God intended it for his good, for Joseph's good. The good that God intended was this. He says, you intended to harm me, but God intended me for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. That was the good that God intended in terms of this story of Joseph and Joseph coming in Egypt. He intended to save all kinds of people through Joseph's leadership during the fruitful years and his leadership during the lean years when the famine was on. That's the good that God intended. It was only a collateral goodness and blessing to Joseph, a personal blessing to Joseph in this. What God intended was to save a number of lives. I think we need to, put that kind of thinking into our interpretation of this Romans 8 passage. It says, for we know that in all things God works together for the good of those who love him. Because when we interpret that okay, if we're going through a hard time or something's happening to us, we can believe that God is going to bring something good into our lives, and it's about us. There's some good going to come to us through this. And that may happen. But friends, God has a much bigger picture. And the good that he's going to bring relates to his purposes in this world more than it does to us and what's going on in our lives. If we are blessed, if we find good in it, and that's collateral. That's a collateral goodness and a collateral blessing to what the big thing that God intends to do. All right, that's on the side. You don't have to pay for that one. Anyway, so Joseph reflected then on the patterns and ways the family he was born into. He faced the reality of it and embraced what had been done to him. And then he chose a different path forward for himself. And when he did that, he broke the power of the past on his life. I said at the beginning that when it comes to the families we're born into, both the good things and the bad things, the positive things, the negative things, the blessings and the sins, all of those things have deeply impacted who we are today and shaped us in terms of who we are today. And I said that becoming who God made us to be will require dealing with any of the sinful patterns or the sinful attitudes or the sinful ways of thinking or the sinful ideas that we have inherited from that. And it will require intentionally asking, why do I do that? when we find ourselves acting or reacting in ways that are inconsistent with God and his kingdom, or find ourselves with attitudes and ways that are inconsistent. And we need to go to the Lord with those things, not just ask ourselves why we do that, but we need to go to the Lord with those things and reflect on that question before him and ask him to show us where the power of those things might be in our lives. Let me just end with this story. I've had to do that many times, that kind of thing many times. And I can't even remember what they were, but there's one time that I remember very, very clearly, because it was one of those watershed times in my life when God was dealing with some, what I would call big things in my life. And what triggered it, the behavior that caused me to ask, why do I do that, was the fact that I just started out, maybe I was a year and a half into working with the Baptist Convention. And what I found was this, that I would come home at night, or different nights, and I would just be angry. Just be angry. I don't know what I was angry at, except it came out against Tawa and the kids and whatever I might be trying to fix down in the basement and it wouldn't work, and I'd fire it against the wall, those kinds of things. But I didn't know, it was kind of like a free-floating anger. And it got so bad that I finally had to just go before the Lord and say, Lord, why? What is this? Where's this coming from? What's going on? Why am I angry? And I actually went for a walk. I walked for 3 hours that particular night with that question in mind. And I just talking to the Lord for the 3 hours and saying, why? Why is that there? What's going on? And the Lord began to speak to me. And the first thing he did, he brought a word to my mind. And I knew it was not just something that I had thought. It had come from the Lord, and it was the word shame. And I remember saying, Lord, what's that got to do with anything? But then he continued, and there were all kinds of images that started to come to my mind, remembrances of things in my past. The first had to do with my relationship with women or girls in my younger years kind of thing. And 3 girlfriends in particular. One when I was in grade 3, one when I was in grade 8, and one when I was in grade 9. In the grade 3 one, I had a crush on this girl in grade 1. And I remember, in that one-room school where Valentine's Day, and you got these little cutout cards for everyone in the school, and everyone gets one for you kind of thing. And I remember going home to my mother and saying, I want to get a special one for this girl in grade 1. And I remember very clearly the reaction, the response of my mother. It was this. You what? And I said, I want to get a special Valentine for... I'm not going to name her, by the way, because she lives up in Oak Point now. and I want to get a special one for her. And Mother said, no, you don't. You're not going to get. Don't be so foolish. You're going to get, just one like you get for everybody else. And so I did. The second girlfriend, that was grade 8. Couldn't let my parents know, couldn't let Mom know that I was interested in this girl and whatever going with the girl at that particular point is, because I knew the reaction was going to be, what? You're not old enough for that. Don't be so foolish. And then grade 11, the same way. Everybody knew about it, but it was like, I don't know why he's doing this. And even when my wife and I were getting married and announced that, I remember, we won't go into the first time that Tawa came to our house, or when she visited. Anyway, but when we were married, or when we were getting married, my grandmother took her aside and said, you can't marry him. What was it she said exactly?
He's too young.
Yeah, he's too young to get married. and so my wife said, well, he's the one who asked me. And so it was like, okay, this is... Anyway, so all of that. And then all kinds of memories started to come, not just with regard to that, but things like whenever I would want to express my opinion, or whatever, there was something that I wanted, or something that was truly me to be expressed, and it was like, I shouldn't do that. It was the attitude. This wasn't, an angry thing or anything like that. It was just the system. This is the way Mom was brought up, and it gets in there, and she didn't even know she was doing this kind of thing. It's just there, and that's the way it is for most of us. It's just there, and so. But what I learned through all of that was this: that in my upbringing, I had learned to be ashamed of what was truly me, of my wishes, my desires, my yearnings, what I wanted. And so much so that I didn't know who I was. I didn't have opinions on things. If somebody asked me, and even today, like I still live in that, if somebody asked me my opinion about this or that, I don't have one right then and there. I have to go and think about it. Some people just, this is what I think about this. My wife's that. She tells me what I think all the time. And but I don't have one opinion. I have to think about it for a while, and then, this is where I am. So it's that kind of thing. And what really happened is that the real me had just kind of been pushed into a place where you couldn't get a hold of it. Like, who am I kind of thing. And that's what was going on. And the reason I was coming home angry was this kind of thing was happening. I was just in this new job, and I was with all these giant people. These people who had been there for years, these older people, the Eugene Thompsons, the Bill O'Grady's, all these people had been in this much longer. I was just a snotty kid at that point. I was only 33 or something like that. Can you imagine that? And working in the denomination. And these old guys who had all this experience. Anyway, here's what was happening. We'd be in meetings at the office during the day, and we'd be talking about things. We'd be making plans as a staff and that kind of stuff. And I'd be sitting there listening to all these guys, and I might have an opinion on what we need to do or a thought on where we need to go. But first of all, I didn't express it, because these guys, you see, being who they were, they had the power to say, "Don't be so foolish. Why would we want to do that?" They wouldn't say that, but in my mind, they had the power to do that. And so I wasn't going to venture what I thought. And most times I didn't know what I thought on it. Yeah, well, that's fine with me, whatever you're thinking. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I agree with that kind of thing. And so impression without expression leads to depression. Even if I did have something to say, I wouldn't say it. Or I was afraid to say it. And anger is all a part of that. And because you weren't expressing yourself or didn't know what you wanted to express when you should have, you just get angry at yourself. And I'd just come home, and Todd would get it, or the barbecue would get it, or something like that. See, I had to deal with that. I had to go back and ask, why am I this way? Why am I responding this way? And I had to deal with that. I had to reconcile that within me. And the way it got reconciled is for me to realize I really don't need to forgive my mother or my parents. I understand now that Mom was brought up in the same atmosphere. Her mother, my grandmother, was brought up in the same atmosphere. And it's just been perpetuated down through the ages. It's not a negative thing. It's just living life. That's what it is. And I love my mother and I love my father. I'm not saying anything against them. It's just saying that's the reality that was there in the family system. And I had to reconcile that in my own life by just understanding that that's the way Mom grew up. And I just had to understand it, and it was okay. It was okay. I'm still weird and twisted and all that kind of stuff, and have to work it out in practice, but I know where it comes from. And God has helped with that. Does that make sense to you? So the title of this message is Forgetting What Is Behind. And forgetting what is behind is not, just letting it go and forgetting all about it, because if you do that, it's going to be there, and it'll come up and it'll sabotage you. It's not about not remembering anymore the negative things. It's not denying the negative things. It's not repressing them, because as I say, they'll come right back up and sabotage your life. No, to forget what is behind in the biblical sense is to face those things and to reconcile them in our hearts with God's help. It's facing them and having God change the narrative of our lives so that we do not perpetuate those things in the future and in our family. It's to deal with them like Joseph did. And let me just end with this. Joseph, when he was in Egypt, which was from age 17 on until he died, Joseph married when he was in Egypt, and he had 2 sons. The first son he named Manasseh. And Manasseh is from the Hebrew word for forget. Why did he name his first son Manasseh? I believe it's because God had enabled him to forget in the sense of reconciling within himself the past that he had experienced. He had a second son. His name was Ephraim. Ephraim is from the Hebrew word for fruitful. And why did he name him that? I believe it's because there was a fruitfulness in Joseph's life in this new narrative that he was living. As a matter of fact, there was life. And I think that's the life that Jesus was talking about when he said, I am come that you might have life and have it abundantly, fruitfully, that there might be fruit in your life. But if we're going to have that, then we have to deal with those things that would hinder us, those things in our past that would hinder us, because they have the power to shape us. And we have to deal with those before God. Does that make sense to you? Well, I've only touched it on the surface, but in this spiritual formation class that we'll be starting this fall, we're going to go deeper into that. But here's your assignment. Yep, here's your assignment for this week. I want you to go before the Lord, or just sit in your own quiet place, and I want you to reflect on attitudes that you have as a person right now. What kind of attitudes? And it might be, and I want you to zero in on one, and I want you to zero in on one that it's an attitude you have perhaps toward a person, or toward a group of people, or just an attitude that you have in life. And I want you to zero in on that, and I want you to then ask the question, why do I have that attitude? I'm not going to get into behaviors now, but why do I have that attitude? And you might feel justified in having that attitude, but deep in your heart you know that, that's not really an attitude that I should have. It's not consistent with what I know about Jesus Christ and about the Christian life. And just reflect on that, and then just take it to the Lord. I mean, reflect on yourself with the question, why am I that way? And then take it to the Lord and say, Lord, why am I that way? What's the root of that? Where does that come from? Can you do that? Spend some time this week doing that, and practice that, forgetting the past. See what God will do with that. See what God will do with that in you. Everyone going to do that? That's what I thought. Good.